Glücksburg Castle, 3 kilometers north of Flensburg, Germany. Paul Nitze sat across from the man who had single-handedly extended World War II by years through sheer organizational brilliance. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, looked remarkably composed for a prisoner of war whose nation lay in ruins. At 40 years old, impeccably dressed despite his circumstances, Speer maintained the bearing of a corporate executive rather than a defeated enemy official. Nitze was trained to Yocha, a former Wall Street investment banker who had traded high finance for government service when his mentor James Forrestal summoned him to Washington in 1940. Now serving as vice chairman of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Nitze had pursued this interrogation for weeks. The war in Europe had ended just 8 days earlier. On May 7th, Germany signed the Instrument of Unconditional Surrender at Reims, France. Adolf Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 20. The Soviet artillery pulverized the streets above. The race to interrogate Speer was over, and Nitze had won. The United Nations War Crimes Commission wanted Speer in chains immediately, demanding he stand trial alongside Hermann Göring and the other Nazi leaders at Nuremberg. But Nitze needed him talking first. The Pacific War still raged. American B-24 superfortresses were systematically incinerating Japanese cities with the same methodical fury unleashed on Germany. Tokyo had burned. Osaka had burned. Nagoya had burned. Yet nobody knew if strategic bombing alone could force Japan's surrender without the nightmare of a ground invasion. Military planners predicted 500,000 American casualties, perhaps more, for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. Every estimate suggested unimaginable carnage as American soldiers fought through cities, villages, and mountain fortresses that Japanese commanders would defend with fanatical determination. Strategic bombing had to work. It had to force capitulation before American forces waded ashore on Kyushu and Honshu. But first, American planners needed to understand what had actually worked against Germany. Only one man possessed the complete answer. The Strategic Bombing Survey had been established in November 1944, following a directive from President Franklin Roosevelt to Secretary of War Henry Stimson. The mission appeared straightforward on paper: to determine what effect strategic bombing had on Germany's ability to wage war, document successes and failures, apply those lessons in the Pacific. Nitze had assembled a remarkable team. John Kenneth Galbraith, the economist who would later achieve fame as a Harvard professor and best-selling author, sat beside him at Glücksburg. George Ball, future Under-Secretary of State in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, had been leading teams across Germany for months, examining bombed factories, interviewing shell-shocked industrialists, studying production records salvaged from facilities Allied bombs had transformed into rubble. But Speer represented the ultimate prize, the keystone that would make sense of all the other interviews, all the documents, all the bomb damage assessments. Speer had run the entire German war economy since February 1942, when he assumed control of the Ministry of Armaments, following the death of his predecessor, Fritz Todt, in an aircraft accident. For 3 years, Speer controlled every factory, every supply chain, every labor allocation decision from the Atlantic coast to the gates of Moscow. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If anyone knew whether strategic bombing had crippled German production or merely inconvenienced it, whether the entire bloody, expensive campaign had justified its cost in aircraft, aircrews, it was Speer. The problem was that Speer understood his value perfectly. He had watched other Nazi leaders in the war's final weeks. Some committed suicide, like Hitler and Goebbels. Some fled and were being hunted like animals. Some were captured and already being prepared for trial. Speer had calculated his odds carefully. His name carried less infamy than Göring's or Himmler's. He had not delivered speeches calling for extermination. He had not operated concentration camps. He was the technocrat, the architect, the production genius who kept Germany fighting years longer than anyone thought possible. If he played this correctly, if he made himself indispensable to the Americans, if he revealed what they desperately needed to know about strategic bombing, perhaps they would protect him from the hangman's noose. Perhaps they would inform the prosecutors at Nuremberg that Speer had been cooperative, had been different from the others, had assisted the Allied cause by explaining what worked and what failed. It was a calculated risk, but Speer was a man who understood calculations. So Speer had decided his strategy before Nitze asked the first question. Complete cooperation. Total transparency. He would tell the Americans everything about German war production, about strategic bombing effects, about Hitler's final days, about the Reich's economic collapse. Everything except the one subject that could guarantee his execution, his knowledge of and complicity in the Holocaust. That topic remained forbidden territory. Speer would maintain he had been too consumed with production to comprehend the full scope of what transpired in the camps. He would claim ignorance while accepting abstract responsibility for German defeat. It was a tightrope to walk, but Speer believed he possessed the balance to traverse it. Nitze grasped this calculation immediately. He observed how Speer leaned forward slightly when questions touched technical matters of production and bombing effectiveness. He noticed how Speer's expression closed like a vault door whenever topics approached moral questions. Nitze made a tactical decision. He would ask about factories, not atrocities, about production numbers, not slave labor, about bomb damage to industrial plants, not extermination camps, obtain the information the strategic bombing survey required, leave war crimes questions for Nuremberg prosecutors who would interrogate Speer in a courtroom with judges, evidence and penalties. Nitze's mission was narrower and more immediate. Determine what strategic bombing accomplished, then apply that knowledge to end the Pacific War before more Americans died. For 7 days, from May 15 through May 21, Nitze and his team questioned Speer 5 hours daily, sometimes extending into evening when Speer proved particularly forthcoming. Each morning, Speer arrived at the interrogation room in that same well-tailored suit, pleasant, cooperative, occasionally offering insights and documents the Americans had not thought to request. He walked them through what he called bombing high school, the education of conquerors in how a nation survives, and ultimately fails to survive, under total air war. Speer began with production statistics, the numbers that had made him famous within the Nazi hierarchy as the miracle worker who kept the war machine operational. When he assumed control of the Armaments Ministry in February 1942, Germany produced approximately 000 aircraft annually. By 1944, production reached 39,807 aircraft. Tank and self-propelled gun production climbed from approximately 4,900 in 1941 to roughly 27,000 in 1944. Ammunition production more than doubled. Artillery pieces, submarines, trucks, small arms all showed similar dramatic increases. The armaments miracle, they called it. Speer's organizational genius supposedly kept Germany in the war years longer than economic fundamentals suggested possible. Nitze listened with intense concentration, taking meticulous notes. The figures impressed him. They also confused him. Something fundamental didn't compute, and Nitze needed to understand the discrepancy. Germany had endured sustained Allied bombing since May 1942, when the Royal Air Force launched its first 1,000-bomber raid against Cologne with unprecedented force. American daylight precision bombing joined the campaign in August 1942, when the 8th Air Force flew its first mission against rail yards in occupied France. By mid-1943, the combined bomber offensive hammered German cities and industrial facilities around the clock. RAF Bomber Command flew night area raids designed to destroy residential areas, kill workers, and shatter civilian morale. The United States Army Air Forces flew daylight precision raids, targeting specific industrial facilities, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, synthetic oil refineries, rail yards, submarine pens. Tens of thousands of bombers dropped millions of tons of tape, explosives on Germany. Cities like Hamburg and Dresden had been transformed into funeral pyres. Berlin was a landscape of rubble. Yet German production tripled under Speer's leadership. How? Nitze needed to understand the mechanism. How does an industrial economy under systematic bombardment increase output by 300%? What were the Germans doing that allowed factories to keep running despite high explosive and incendiary bombs falling night and day? Speer explained the defensive measures in detail, speaking like a professor lecturing students. Dispersal of production, moving critical manufacturing to small workshops scattered across countryside where bombers were unlikely to locate them. Transfer of entire facilities to underground locations, converted mines, railway tunnels, anywhere offering protection from bombs. Ruthless prioritization of resources, cutting civilian production to zero to free materials and labor for war goods. Redundancy in supply. Chains ensuring that if one factory was destroyed, others could increase output to compensate. Improved industrial processes developed by German engineers working under constant bombing pressure. Streamlining of aircraft and tank designs to reduce component counts, simplify assembly, accelerate production. Exploitation of forced labor from occupied territories, millions of workers brought to Germany against their will to replace German men, conscripted into the Wehrmacht. Speer made it sound almost reasonable, clinical a logistics and management problem he had solved through administrative competence and organizational innovation. He discussed production lines and labor allocation the way a man might discuss optimizing factory efficiency during peacetime. No mention of the conditions those forced laborers endured: the starvation, the beatings, the deaths in factories and camps. But then Speer mentioned something that made Nitze stop writing and look up from his notes. A date. May 12, 1944. Speer said he would never forget that date. On that day, 935 American heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force struck German synthetic oil production facilities in central and eastern Germany in the largest concentrated attack on petroleum infrastructure, executed to that point in the war. The primary target was the Lunar synthetic oil plant near Merseburg, Germany's single largest producer of aviation gasoline. Other major facilities at Politz near Stettin, Brooks in occupied Czechoslovakia, Bolin, Zeitz, and Lützgendorf also sustained heavy damage. Speer said that attack changed everything. Until May 12, Germany had managed to produce approximately as many weapons as the armed forces required, despite considerable losses to Allied bombing. After May 12, everything began collapsing. The armaments miracle was finished. The war was effectively lost, though it would require another 11 months of fighting and hundreds of thousands more deaths before Germany surrendered. Nitze took careful notes. This was the critical insight he had come to find. Not tanks, not aircraft, not ball bearings. Oil. Fuel. The substance that made every weapon system mobile and operational, Speer continued, and the story became starker. After the May attacks on oil production, Germany's monthly synthetic fuel output dropped catastrophically. In April 1944, Germany produced 316,000 tons of aviation gasoline and other petroleum products. By July, production had collapsed to 107,000 tons. By September, it had disintegrated to less than 50,000 tons. The attacks continued relentlessly. American heavy bombers returned to synthetic oil plants again and again. Whenever German workers repaired damage and restarted production, more bombers arrived. The refineries became the most heavily defended targets in Germany, ringed with anti-aircraft guns, protected by fighter squadrons, diverted from other fronts. Nothing helped. The Americans kept coming. By December 1944, German fuel production was what Speer termed catastrophic. The Luftwaffe could not fly. Pilot training, already reduced to dangerously low hours, was curtailed further because insufficient gasoline existed to keep training aircraft airborne. New fighter squadrons received aircraft but sat grounded for lack of fuel. German jet fighters, the Mi-262, that was technologically superior to any Allied fighter, were produced in substantial numbers, but could not be deployed effectively because fuel didn't exist for training pilots to fly them or for operational squadrons to sustain combat missions. Panzer divisions could not move. Commanders had to choose between using limited fuel allocations for training exercises or conserving it for combat. Usually they chose conservation, which meant tank crews entered battle with insufficient training, which meant higher losses, which meant more replacement crews needed more training, which required more fuel. That didn't exist. A death spiral. When Germany launched its final major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944, German planners allocated barely enough fuel for attacking divisions to reach initial objectives. The operational plan explicitly counted on capturing Allied fuel depots to sustain the offensive beyond the first days. When that capture failed, when American resistance proved stronger than German intelligence predicted, entire panzer formations ran out of gasoline in the Ardennes forest and had to be abandoned by their crews. Thousands of tanks that had been painstakingly built in dispersed factories, that had survived the journey to the front, that had functioning guns and trained crews, sat immobilized because no fuel existed to move them. Nitze pressed for details about other bombing targets. What about the famous raids on Schweinfurt, the city producing most of Germany's ball bearings? American bombers hit Schweinfurt twice in 1943, suffering devastating losses. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14th cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers and 600 air crews. Surely that raid, targeting such a critical component, had crippled German production. Speer smiled slightly, a practiced smile, the kind a teacher might give a student asking an obvious question. Ball bearings, Speer explained, had never been the bottleneck Americans believed them to be. Germany had stockpiled months of supply before the raids. When production at Schweinfurt dropped, German engineers substituted simpler bearings in applications not requiring high precision. They used sleeve bearings, plain bearings, anything reducing ball bearing consumption. They imported bearings from Sweden and Switzerland through supply channels, remaining open despite the Allied blockade. The attacks on Schweinfurt had cost Germany production capacity, certainly, but they had not crippled anything, not even close. Meanwhile, those two raids cost the Americans irreplaceable heavy bombers and experienced crews. From Speer's perspective, Schweinfurt had been a net victory for Germany. What about attacks on transportation networks, the rail system moving raw materials to factories and finished weapons to the front? Speer considered this had been increasingly effective, particularly in the war's final months. By February 1945, the Ruhr industrial region, Germany's manufacturing heartland, was completely isolated from its coal supplies. Finished tanks could not reach the Eastern Front. Raw materials could not reach factories. But Speer noted that transportation attacks only became decisive late in the war, after Germany was already losing for other reasons, primarily the fuel crisis, making movement impossible even when rail lines remained intact. What about attacks on aircraft production facilities? Speer explained that aircraft production peaked in 1944 at 807 planes, the highest of the entire war. How was that possible if Allied bombers systematically attacked aircraft factories? Speer's answer was devastating in its simplicity. Factories were dispersed. Production moved to underground facilities. Assembly was broken into smaller steps performed in workshops difficult to target. The Germans became extremely efficient at building aircraft. The problem wasn't production. The problem was fuel. You can build all the fighters you want, Speer said, but if you cannot fuel them, cannot train pilots to fly them, cannot get them to operational airfields, they are useless. Germany produced thousands of aircraft in 1944 that never flew a single combat mission. They sat on airfields or in factories, abandoned for lack of fuel and trained pilots. Building an airplane took weeks, training a pilot took months. Producing the fuel to fly them required refinery capacity that Allied bombers had destroyed. Nitze was beginning to perceive the pattern. Strategic bombing had not failed. It had succeeded, but only where it targeted the one thing Germany could not replace, could not substitute, could not work around: oil. Everything else, Speer had found solutions for. Factories could be moved or rebuilt. Equipment could be repaired. Workers could be replaced with forced labor from occupied territories. Production processes could be streamlined and simplified. But oil was finite. Germany possessed virtually no natural petroleum reserves. The Reich depended entirely on synthetic fuel plants converting coal into gasoline and diesel through complex chemical processes. When those plants were destroyed, no alternative existed. Romania had provided natural crude oil from the Ploiești fields until Soviet forces overran Romania in August 1944. After that, Germany was operating on whatever synthetic fuel its battered refineries could still produce, and that amount was shrinking with every bombing raid. On the afternoon of May 18, 3 days into the interrogation, Nitze shifted topics. He asked Speer about American industrial capacity. What did German leadership understand about American production capability before the war? What intelligence did they possess? What did they believe America could produce? This was where the conversation transformed. This was where Nitze began understanding something transcending bombing effectiveness. Something fundamental about why Germany lost and why America won. Speer paused before answering, choosing his words carefully. He said that in the war's early years, from 1939 through 1941, Hitler and the German High Command did not take American industrial capacity seriously. They viewed America as weak, divided, isolationist, still suffering economically from the Great Depression. When President Franklin Roosevelt announced in May 1940 that America would produce 50,000 aircraft in the next year and 125,000 aircraft by 1943, along with 120,000 tanks in the same period, German military advisors dismissed these figures as propaganda. Impossible numbers, they said. Ridiculous American boasting meant to intimidate Germany and reassure Britain. Hitler agreed with this assessment. He believed the numbers were fantasy, desperate lies from a weak nation trying to appear strong. The numbers were not fantasy, they were underestimates. By the time Speer took over the Armaments Ministry in February 1942, intelligence reports reaching Berlin suggested American production far exceeded anything Germany could match. Speer requested detailed analysis. What were the Americans actually producing? How much? How quickly could Germany match these rates? The answers that returned were staggering and terrifying. In 1941, the United States produced approximately 19,000 combat aircraft. In 1942, that number reached roughly 48,000. In 1943, approximately 86,000. In 1944, approximately 96,000. Those were combat aircraft only, not including trainers, transports, and other non-combat types. Speer stopped speaking for a moment. Nitze waited, sensing something important, approaching. Then Speer spoke words that Nitze would remember for the rest of his life. He said that when he finally examined complete American production statistics in late 1943, he understood with absolute certainty that Germany had already lost the war, not because of any battle or campaign, not because of German strategic errors or tactical failures, but because Germany's industrial capacity was eclipsed by overwhelming American material superiority. No scenario existed, no possible strategy, no wonder weapon, no tactical brilliance that could overcome such massive production disparity. The war was over. Germany would keep fighting because surrender was unthinkable, and because Hitler refused to accept reality. But the outcome was already determined by numbers that could not be changed. Nitze asked for specifics. Speer provided them with the precision of an accountant reciting a balance sheet. Total American aircraft production from 1941 to 1945 exceeded 300 planes. Germany produced approximately 119,000. American tank and self-propelled gun production exceeded 88,000 units. Germany produced approximately 49,000. The United States built approximately 700 major naval vessels, including aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. Germany built fewer than 10 major surface warships. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it like this video, it means a lot to us. But it wasn't merely the absolute quantity that mattered, though that alone was decisive. It was the speed, the rate of production, the staggering pace at which American factories generated finished weapons. American shipyards were producing Liberty ships, Ds, 00 Seroton, cargo vessels faster than German submarines could sink them. In 1942 and 1943, German U-boats sank Allied merchant vessels at rates that should have strangled Britain's supply lines. Vessels faster than U-boats could sink them. By autumn 1943, all Allied shipping losses since the war's beginning in 1939 had been replaced. The Atlantic was no longer a graveyard for Allied shipping. It had become a highway for American production flowing to Europe. Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan produced B-24 Liberator heavy bombers at a rate of one complete aircraft every 63 minutes. One bomber with more than 1.5 million individual parts, rolling off an assembly line every hour, 24 hours per day. A single factory, producing the most complex weapon system in the American arsenal, with the same efficiency Ford had produced automobiles. Germany possessed nothing comparable. German aircraft production remained based on skilled craftsmen, carefully assembling components with attention to quality. American production was based on mass manufacturing principles, interchangeable parts, assembly line techniques perfected in the automotive industry. When American automobile companies converted to war production, they brought that expertise with them. Chrysler manufactured aircraft fuselages. General Motors made airplane engines, guns, trucks, and tanks. Packard built Rolls-Royce engines for the British Royal Air Force. Ford made everything from jeeps to bombers. Speer said he had tried reorganizing German industry along American mass production principles. He streamlined tank and aircraft designs, reduced the number of different models being produced simultaneously, pushed for standardization and interchangeable parts. He achieved remarkable production gains. German output tripled under his leadership. But every gain was meaningless. Germany was sprinting on a treadmill. For every increase Speer achieved, American production increased by a larger absolute number. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft. Germany's best year was 39,807. The ratio was worse than dos contra uno, and that was just aircraft. The disparity was similar, or worse in every other category of military production. But there was something else, something Speer said he had not fully understood until it was too late to matter. America was not just producing weapons for itself. Under the Lend-Lease program authorized by Congress in March 1941, American factories were supplying military equipment to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, Free France, and every other nation fighting the Axis powers. American factories equipped British soldiers, fed Soviet armies, transported Chinese forces. By 1944, American industry was producing approximately two-thirds of all Allied military equipment used in the war. Britain was a formidable industrial power. The Soviet Union had relocated entire factories east of the Ural Mountains beyond German bomber range, and was producing enormous quantities of 24 tanks, and Sturmovik ground attack aircraft. Yet American output exceeded both combined. And America was doing this while simultaneously raising an army of over 2 million men, maintaining a two-ocean navy fighting Germany in the Atlantic and Japan in the Pacific, conducting strategic bombing campaigns in both theaters, preparing the largest amphibious invasion force in history for D-Day in Normandy, and somehow still increasing civilian consumption at home. American gross national product grew by 52% between 1939 and 1944. The war did not impoverish America. It enriched the nation. American factories produced military equipment at rates that seemed impossible, while American citizens bought more consumer goods than they had before the war started. Speer told Nitze that this was what German military intelligence had failed to understand in 1939 when they assessed whether Germany should fear American entry into the war. Herman analysts observed American isolationism, political divisions, economic problems lingering from the Depression, and concluded the United States would not be a significant factor. Even after Pearl Harbor, when Hitler declared war on America in December 1941, German leadership believed the Japanese would keep American attention focused on the Pacific. They were catastrophically wrong. America fought a two-front global war and overwhelmed both opponents simultaneously. Nitze asked when German leadership realized the true scale of American production capacity. Speer said it became undeniable by mid-1943. That was when the tide turned everywhere at once. Submarine construction had been a priority, but American destroyers and aircraft were hunting U-boats with new radar and sonar technology, and American shipyards were replacing every sunk merchant vessel with 2 new ones. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union was using American trucks, American aircraft, American supplies delivered through Murmansk and Persia to sustain offensives that pushed German forces steadily westward. In North Africa, American forces had landed in Operation Torch with overwhelming material superiority, and German and Italian forces were being compressed between American armies advancing from the west and British armies from the east. In the Pacific, American carrier production meant Japan faced a foe that grew stronger with every passing month, while Japan's own carrier fleet was being systematically destroyed. And over Germany, American bomber formations were appearing in greater numbers every week. 8th Air Force in England, 15th Air Force in Italy. Formations of hundreds of heavy bombers escorted by long-range fighters hitting targets in broad daylight. The Luftwaffe tried desperately to stop them. German fighter production was high. Pilots were initially skilled. New aircraft types like the Mi-262 jet fighter showed technological superiority over anything the Allies flew. And even when fuel was available, the sheer weight of American numbers was overwhelming. For every German fighter shot down, the Americans replaced it with multiple new aircraft. German pilot losses could not be replaced. Training required fuel that no longer existed. By 1945, Luftwaffe squadrons were sending pilots with less than 50 hours of flight time to face American and British veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience. The engagements were not battles, they were massacres. Speer said there was a moment in late 1943 when he considered approaching Hitler with the truth that Germany could not win, that American production made victory mathematically impossible, that the war should be ended through negotiation, while Germany still held leverage, while German forces still controlled territory, before the Reich was completely destroyed. But Speer did not possess the courage to speak those words. Hitler still believed in wonder weapons, in secret projects that would reverse Germany's fortunes, the Vuno flying bomb, the V-dose ballistic missile, advanced jet fighters, new submarine designs. Speer knew none of these weapons would matter. You cannot win a war with technological advantages when the enemy is producing conventional weapons at 10 times your rate. But he kept that knowledge to himself and kept the factories running. Men kept dying for a cause already lost. On May 20th, Nitze asked Speer about Hitler's Nero decree, the Scorched Earth Order, from March 1945. With defeat inevitable, Hitler had ordered the destruction of all industrial facilities, transportation, infrastructure, utilities, anything that might be valuable to advancing Allied armies. Germany itself was to be destroyed rather than allowed to fall into enemy hands intact. Speer said he had disobeyed the order. He claimed he transferred his loyalty from Hitler to the German people and the future of the German nation. He sabotaged implementation of the decree, ensured that critical factories and bridges were not destroyed, tried to preserve what remained of German industrial capacity for post-war reconstruction. Whether it was entirely truthful was debatable, but it would help Speer at his trial. It would allow him to present himself as the Nazi who tried to limit destruction, who thought about Germany's future, who was different from the fanatical nihilists around Hitler who wanted to drag Germany down with them. On the morning of May 21st, Nitze received a message from his military liaison officer. The Americans were planning to arrest Speer and other members of the Flensburg government on May 23rd. They would be handed over to Allied authorities for war crimes prosecution. If Nitze had remaining questions, he had less than 2 days. Nitze asked Speer to describe Hitler's final days in the Berlin bunker. Speer provided details. He had visited Hitler on April 23, 1945, one of the last people to see the Führer alive. He described a broken man, physically deteriorating, trembling, ranting about betrayals, issuing impossible orders to armies that no longer existed, convinced that willpower alone could still achieve victory. Hitler believed to the end that German spirit would overcome material disadvantage, that determination, courage, and ideological conviction could defeat American bombers and Soviet tanks. Speer said it was madness. Spirit does not stop bombs. Willpower does not manufacture fuel. Determination does not build tanks. On May 23rd, exactly as predicted, British and American military police arrested Speer and other members of the Flensburg government aboard the ship Patria during a meeting arranged under the pretense of negotiation. Tanks surrounded Glucksburg Castle. Armed troops entered Speer's quarters and informed him he was under arrest. Speer reportedly said, "So now the end has come. That is good." Facilities, eventually arriving at Nuremberg, where the International Military Tribunal would try him alongside 23's other senior Nazi leaders. Nitze and Galbraith moved on. They compiled their findings into reports. The Strategic Bombing Survey would eventually publish its conclusions in September 1945, over 200 volumes for the European theatre alone. The essential findings were clear. Strategic bombing had been decisive in defeating Germany, but not in the ways pre-war air power theorists had predicted. The attacks on German civilian morale had largely failed. The Germans endured bombing with remarkable resilience. Cities were destroyed, but factories kept producing. Workers appeared, despite having their homes destroyed, despite food shortages, despite everything. The attacks on ball-bearing production, on aircraft factories, on many of the precision targets Allied planners thought were critical, had achieved limited results. Germany had worked around those losses through dispersal, redundancy, and substitution. But the campaign against oil had worked. The systematic destruction of synthetic fuel plants from May 1944 onward had crippled the Wehrmacht. Without fuel, Germany's military effectiveness dropped by approximately 80% in the war's final months. You can build tanks and aircraft, but if you cannot fuel them, cannot move them, cannot train operators to use them, they are useless metal. The survey estimated that the oil campaign had shortened the war in Europe by months, had saved countless Allied lives, and had proven that strategic bombing could be decisive when properly targeted. Nitze took those lessons to Japan. He arrived in Nagasaki in September, shortly after atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He walked through ruins that made Berlin look almost untouched. He examined destruction that exceeded anything conventional bombs had achieved. He interviewed survivors who described what no human should ever have to describe. The survey's conclusions for the Pacific Theater would eventually argue that Japan had been on the verge of surrender even without atomic bombs, primarily due to the destruction of its merchant fleet and severance of supply lines from resources in occupied territories. Just as Germany had collapsed without fuel, Japan was collapsing without the raw materials its industries needed. The mechanism was different, but the principle was identical. Modern industrialized warfare cannot be sustained without resources, and an enemy with overwhelming naval and air superiority can sever those resources. The interrogation of Speer shaped American defense policy for decades. Paul Nitze would serve in nearly every presidential administration from Truman through Reagan. He helped design the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Western Europe. He was the principal author of NSC 68, the foundational document of Cold War containment strategy. He negotiated arms control treaties with the Soviet Union. He spent 40 years at the highest levels of American national security decision-making, but he never forgot what Speer told him in May 1945 that modern wars between industrial powers are ultimately won by the side with greater productive capacity. That material superiority, when sufficiently overwhelming, determines outcomes more reliably than strategy, tactics, or courage. That America's ability to outproduce any rival was its greatest strategic advantage. Albert Speer was convicted at Nuremberg of war crimes and crimes against humanity, primarily for his use of slave labor in armaments factories. He was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment at Spandau prison. The tribunal noted his efforts to sabotage Hitler's scorched earth decree and acknowledged that Speer had been one of the few Nazi leaders to accept personal responsibility for the regime's actions, though that responsibility was carefully limited to avoid admitting knowledge of the Holocaust. He served his full sentence without parole and was released on October 1, 1966. He published 2 memoirs that became international bestsellers and maintained his carefully constructed image as the apolitical technocrat who had been seduced by Hitler's charisma but remained fundamentally decent. This narrative, known as the Speer myth, dominated historiography for decades. Only in the 1982 and 1992, when historians gained access to documents Speer had hidden, did the full truth emerge. He had extensive knowledge of the Holocaust. He personally expanded Auschwitz. He knew exactly what was happening to Jewish workers in his factories. His entire post-war story was a carefully constructed lie, designed to evade the death penalty and rehabilitate his reputation. But in May 1945, Nitze did not know this. He knew only that Speer had provided the information the strategic bombing survey needed. Speer died in London on September 1, 1981, at age 76, while visiting the United Kingdom. His death prompted obituaries describing him as the good Nazi, the one who accepted responsibility, the architect who became a reluctant war criminal. These obituaries infuriated Holocaust survivors and historians who knew the truth. Nitze died on October 19, 2004, at age 97. His obituary in the New York Times described him as one of the architects of American Cold War strategy, a man who helped shape 50 years of foreign policy. It mentioned the strategic bombing survey in a single paragraph and did not mention what Speer told him about American production eclipsing German capacity. The strategic bombing survey reports remain in archives, studied occasionally by military historians and defense analysts. The findings on oil targeting influenced air campaign planning in subsequent wars, though commanders often ignored lessons about what does not work. The Vietnam War saw American bombers repeat many of the same mistakes that failed in World War II, targeting infrastructure and morale, rather than focusing on resources that could not be replaced. The Gulf War in 1991 returned to the survey's principles, with planners targeting Iraqi oil production, electrical generation, and transportation networks while avoiding indiscriminate city bombing. The campaign succeeded in its objectives, and military historians credited careful study of strategic bombing survey findings. Soviet manpower that ground down the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, Allied strategic bombing that destroyed German infrastructure, Hitler's strategic blunders, the cracking of German codes that gave Allies critical intelligence advantages. Every factor contributed, but Speer told Nitze the answer. In May, 1945, Germany lost because American production exceeded German production by ratios that made German defeat. Inevitabile, dos, una pulgada aircraft, nearly dos, una pulgada tanks, 10 contra una or more, in naval vessels, overwhelming superiority in trucks, artillery, ammunition, every category of military equipment. And there was nothing Germany could do to match that output. The Ruhr industrial region was Europe's manufacturing heartland. German engineering was world-class. German workers were skilled and disciplined. German scientists developed jet fighters, ballistic missiles, nearly achieved nuclear fission. None of that mattered when facing an opponent who could produce 5 fighters for every one. Germany built, who could replace every sunken cargo ship with 2 more, who could land 1 million soldiers on a hostile beach with complete logistical support, because the industrial base could supply them indefinitely. This was the revelation Paul Nitze carried from Glucksburg Castle in May 1945. Not just that strategic bombing worked when it targeted oil that was tactically important, but strategically, the larger lesson was about industrial capacity as the foundation of military power in modern warfare. America had demonstrated a form of economic power that no rival could match without fundamentally transforming their entire economic system. The Soviet Union understood this lesson. Stalin's post-war industrial build-up was designed explicitly to match American productive capacity. The nuclear arms race was partly driven by this understanding. If you cannot match American conventional production, develop weapons that offset numerical disadvantages. Soviet industrial expansion. In the 1952 and 1962 was an attempt to create an industrial base that could sustain conflict with the United States. It failed. The Soviet economy collapsed in 1991, unable to match American military spending while maintaining civilian living standards. Instead of trying to outproduce America through communist central planning, China integrated itself into global trade networks, attracted foreign investment, built manufacturing capacity by serving as the world's factory, then used economic growth to fund military modernization. By 2020, Chinese industrial output exceeded American production in many categories. Whether this translates to military advantage in any future conflict remains uncertain, but Chinese strategists studied the Strategic Bombing Survey and understand what Speer told Nitze wars between industrial powers are won by the side that sustains production longer, replaces losses faster, and brings overwhelming material advantage to bear. The core findings of the Strategic Bombing Survey remain relevant. Target resources that cannot be replaced. Understand that civilian morale is far more resilient than pre-war theorists believed. Recognize that industrial dispersal and redundancy can overcome even heavy bombing. Accept that modern warfare is ultimately a contest of industrial capacity. The side with more factories, more resources, more workers, and superior production systems wins if other factors are roughly equal. This was what Nitze learned from 7 days of interrogation in May 1945. Germany could not win because America's material superiority was mathematically insurmountable. Speer had known this since late 1943. He kept producing anyway because stopping meant immediate collapse. But he knew. And when he told Nitze that knowledge shaped 4 decades of American defense policy, the strategic implications extended beyond World War II. During the Korean War, American industrial capacity again proved decisive. When Chinese forces entered the conflict in late 1950, they possessed numerical superiority but lacked the industrial base to sustain modern warfare. American factories supplied United Nations forces with equipment, ammunition, and supplies that Chinese and North Korean forces could not match. The Vietnam War presented a different challenge. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong did not fight a conventional industrial war. They employed guerrilla tactics, relied on Soviet and Chinese aid, and exploited political constraints that limited American military options. Industrial superiority mattered less when the enemy avoided conventional battles and when political factors constrained the application of military power. But the fundamental principles Speer identified remained valid in conflicts where industrial capacity can be applied. The side with greater productive power possesses a decisive advantage. The question is whether the nature of the conflict allows that advantage to be exploited. The Cold War validated Speer's insights on a grand scale. The United States and Soviet Union never fought directly, but their industrial competition shaped the conflict. The Soviet Union attempted to match American military production across all categories: nuclear weapons, conventional forces, naval power, air power, space capabilities. The effort strained Soviet resources to the breaking point. By the 1982, the Soviet economy was devoting an estimated 15 to 20% of GDP to military spending, compared to roughly 6% for the United States. The disparity in absolute economic size meant the Soviet Union was attempting to match American military power from a much smaller industrial base. Soviet citizens endured persistent shortages, substandard housing, limited consumer goods, technological backwardness in civilian sectors. Meanwhile, American citizens enjoyed rising living standards, technological innovation, consumer abundance. The contrast between Western prosperity and Eastern deprivation ultimately undermined Soviet legitimacy. When the Soviet system finally collapsed between 1989 and 1991, the outcome reflected economic competition the Soviets had lost decades earlier. They could not match American productive capacity while providing acceptable living standards to their citizens. The attempt to do both bankrupted the system. China observed this failure and adopted a different strategy. Rather than attempting to match American military power immediately, China focused first on building industrial capacity and economic strength. By integrating into global trade, attracting foreign investment, and developing manufacturing capabilities, China created an economic foundation that could eventually support military modernization. By 2020, China had become the world's largest manufacturing nation by many measures. This industrial capacity, built over decades of economic growth, provides the foundation for military capabilities that increasingly challenge American dominance in the Western Pacific. Whether China can translate industrial capacity into military advantage remains uncertain, but the strategy reflects lessons learned from studying how America defeated Germany and outlasted the Soviet Union. The contemporary relevance of Speer's insights about industrial capacity faces new complications. Modern warfare increasingly emphasizes technology over mass production. Precision weapons, advanced sensors, networked communications, and autonomous systems may matter more than absolute quantities of conventional equipment. A smaller force, equipped with superior technology, might defeat a larger force using obsolete systems. Yet, the fundamental principle persists. Sustained military operations require industrial capacity to replace losses, maintain equipment, and supply forces. The side with greater productive capacity retains advantages, even if the nature of those advantages has evolved. The 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine demonstrated this principle's continued relevance. Russia possessed numerical superiority in tanks, artillery, and manpower. But Western nations, primarily the United States, supplied Ukraine with advanced weapons, intelligence support, and ammunition that allowed smaller Ukrainian forces to inflict devastating losses on Russian attackers. As the conflict extended beyond Russia's initial expectations, industrial capacity became increasingly important. Russia struggled to replace equipment losses. Artillery ammunition supplies became constrained. Western sanctions limited Russia's access to components for precision weapons. Meanwhile, Western military industries, while smaller than during World War II, retained the capacity to sustain Ukraine's defense. The conflict demonstrated that industrial capacity remains relevant, even in modern warfare, characterized by precision weapons and advanced technology. The ability to produce and supply munitions, maintain equipment, and replace losses still matters. The lessons Paul Nitze learned from Albert Speer in May 1945 continue resonating in contemporary strategic planning. American defense policy still emphasizes maintaining industrial capacity sufficient to support sustained military operations. The defense industrial base, the network of companies, facilities, and workers capable of defenses to specified, producing military equipment, receives attention as a strategic asset comparably to military forces themselves. This represents the enduring legacy of Speer's revelation about industrial capacity determining warfare outcomes. The interrogation at Glucksburg Castle in May 1945 lasted 7 days, but its implications shaped decades of strategic thinking. Speer's honest assessment that Germany lost, because American production made victory impossible, provided insights that transcended World War II's specific circumstances. The fundamental principle that modern industrial warfare favors the side with superior productive capacity remained valid through the Cold War, continues influencing contemporary strategic competition, and will likely remain relevant as long as military operations require industrial support. The magnitude of American industrial achievement during World War II. 300 aircraft, 88 tanks, 700 major naval vessels, 2,000,000 trucks, 193,000 artillery pieces demonstrated productive capacity unprecedented in human history. That achievement rested on specific circumstances: democratic governance that mobilized voluntary cooperation, market economics that efficiently allocated resources, technological innovation that improved processes, social transformation that expanded the workforce, and national unity that sustained effort over years. Whether those conditions can be replicated in future conflicts remains uncertain, but the historical example stands as evidence that democratic industrial societies, when threatened and unified, can mobilize resources on scales matching or exceeding authoritarian regimes. This was the ultimate lesson Paul Nitze learned from interrogating Albert Speer, that free people working toward common goals can outproduce coerced labor, that democratic societies possess latent strengths that only emerge when truly challenged, that America's greatest strategic advantage is not any specific weapon system, but the industrial capacity and national will to produce whatever victory requires. Speer understood this in 1943 when he saw American production statistics and realized Germany had already lost. He told Nitze in 1945, hoping cooperation might save him from execution. Nitze carried that knowledge through 4 decades of government service, shaping policies that helped America win the Cold War without fighting World War III. The interrogation at Glucksburg Castle lasted 7 days, but its consequences echoed through the remainder of the 20th century and continue influencing strategic thought in the 21st. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.